Hi and welcome to the aquaculture module. Aquaculture is not commonly considered as part of a permaculture type system, but there's quite a wide variety of benefits in incorporating an aquaculture system into your design. So we'll break that down in this unit, look at some of the relative advantages of aquaculture, how it can be incorporated into a whole farm design system, and some of the different options in New Zealand as far as the species we have available to us and how we can integrate them into aquaculture designs. But firstly, just a bit of an introduction and background to aquaculture. So it's been around in New Zealand since about the 1980s, and it's been focused mainly on salmon and mussels and oysters, but it's also diversified recently into some game fish as well, like kingfish. And there's a NIWA research station up in Northland that are investigating different options as far as aquaculture goes. To start with, maybe with aquaculture is a bit of a background to the food chain, so an aquatic food chain, and a recognition perhaps of some of the different opportunities within that food chain to produce commercially viable species. And then once you fit them into that food chain, you can see the various options to diversify production, so to incorporate other compatible fish and plant species into that production, and just mapping that food chain out and seeing what possibilities there are to fit different species together. So when you look at a food chain, there's the producers down the bottom. So in an aquaculture system, that's going to be the algae, the water plants, any marginal or riparian plants that are on the borders of that habitat. And they're going to be fed on by aquatic insects and snails and vegetarian fishes that will graze those algae and water plants. And the insects and the snails and the water plants are in turn also eaten by omnivorous fish. And then you've got insectivore fish that are focusing on just the consumption of the water insects and snails. And then right at the top of the food chain, you've got the predatory fish that are eating a wide range of other smaller fish or some of the bigger insects as well. So recognizing this, you can start to construct the species that are compatible to your particular location and see which ones you can fit together and will be compatible in a system. So for example, in New Zealand, if we've got a system that's producing goldfish and there's maybe mosquito fish in that system already, you could use those mosquito fish as a feeder fish for the goldfish. The mosquito fish will be more of a small insectivorous fish, while the goldfish is more of an omnivore. So the goldfish will graze the plants, they will eat the mosquito fish, and the two can be quite compatible in the design of that system, and they can be incorporated into the production of lily plants that neither of them will damage, and riparian plants for the filtering of runoff from other systems before it enters into that aquaculture system. So some of the considerations with the design of an aquaculture system is the shape, the water quality, the flow rate of the water, and then some particular aspects such as oxygen levels and temperature and flow rate, which will affect the habitat and the quality of that habitat for the production species involved. So if we tackle oxygen concentration to begin with, oxygen is required by all plant and animal species for respiration, so to break down their food and to release the energy from their food. So the higher the concentration of water the higher the concentration of oxygen in the water, the higher the stocking rate of the fish in particular that you can put into that water system. And the bigger those fish can also get in many situations too, because they've got a richer habitat. So some of the things you can do to increase the oxygen concentration is to increase the flow rate through that aquatic system, to shade it, to reduce the temperature, because the hotter water gets, the less oxygen can dissolve into that water. So as you cool the water down, more oxygen can dissolve into that water and therefore support a greater number of fish species in it. And that can be also helped by shading the ponds. So if you plant out along the riparian edge of the plant, create a bit of shade over that water, that will help cool the water down and lower the temperatures, in addition to creating a circulation of water in that system to help create a flow of water on the surface. And it's on the surface of the water which is where the oxygen is dissolving into the water and dissolving out of the water. So if you want to calculate the oxygen carrying capacity of a particular body of water, you need to know the surface area of that water. So the greater the surface area, the more opportunity there is for oxygen to dissolve into the water and to dissolve out again. And then the flow rate, or the disturbance on the water, and that agitation also helps the diffusion of oxygen into it, and the temperature of the water too. So the lower the temperature, the more oxygen can dissolve into it. So you can modify those elements to increase the oxygen concentration and therefore the stocking rate of that pond. For the flow rate, if there's not a natural flow of water through it, either from pumping off from a pond, a stream through that pond, so there's a continuous flow rate, you can set up some pumps on a solar panel. So that solar panel can drive some pumps, so there's a closed loop circulatory system of water in that pond system. You can incorporate that pumping of water in with a filtering mechanism too, so you can pump it through a water circulation system, so that as the water circulates through that, it's going to be oxygenated before it hits back into the pond again. Or it could go through a gravel bed that has reeds growing in it, and as it goes through the gravel, it's going to get oxygenated, but also purified by the bacteria living on those stones, but also the biological action of the reeds and the microbiology associated with the roots of the reeds will cleanse the excess nutrients out of that water before it goes back into that pond again. Or you can even integrate the two. So the flow form, I'm remembering its name now, so as it goes through the flow form and gets oxygenated, it can then go through a gravel reed bed, and the bacteria and the reeds in that reed bed will help clean the water before it goes back into the pond again. And then by planting out the pond, you can help keep that pond cool and the temperatures as low as possible. Or alternatively, if there's availability of a local stream or a pond that you can pump from, it can go through your system and then back into that waterway again, as long as there's not, as long as there's some level of purification of the water before it goes back into that natural water body again. So after leaving your aquaculture system, if it goes through a wetland system, that will help take out any excess nutrients before it goes back into that natural habitat again, so that it doesn't contaminate that natural habitat. Some of the shapes that can influence production, if it's quite a high flow rate through that water system, a more sigmoidal shape that imitates the natural bending shape of a river will help create a nice laminar flow of water through that system, so that there's not too much turbulence that can stress the fish. And also an increase in edge through, instead of just a straight channel that the water goes through, the bending of the stream will help replicate the natural flowing form of a stream, create more habitat, create more surface area, create more edges on that system to increase production. One of the aspects that is linked to increasing production is also an increase in the edging of the pond, because the edge interaction between two species is also a provision of resources. So there's food, there's nutrients in the terrestrial or land system that joins that aquaculture system, and the more edge between those two systems, the more opportunity there is for resources from the terrestrial system to get into the aquatic system, like insects or nutrients that are going to increase the production. It also gives more area to plant, so that the trees that are planted can reach further out into the middle of the pond and create more shade to reduce the temperature and increase the oxygen concentration within that water body. Some of the other considerations as far as the design of an aquaculture system is to increase the volume of the pond. So the bigger the volume of the pond, the more opportunities there is for the breakdown of nutrients in that pond, the more buffering effect there is, so that that water body will be less sensitive to changes in temperature or changes in oxygen concentration or peaks in nutrient spikes if there's some input of nutrients from the surrounding landform, maybe associated with fertilizer use or a high stocking rate and a high rainfall washing those manures down into your aquaculture system, or if there's some death of fish, maybe associated with a peak in temperature or a drop in oxygen levels, it might kill some fish off, and that can lead to a spike in nutrient levels that can also contaminate the water. And the bigger the water body is, the less vulnerable that water body is to all those different potential problems that can affect your production in the aquaculture system. Other things are guilds of plants and fish. So to try to diversify your production, and as much as possible try to diversify them in commercially viable species. So some selection of plants, maybe some riparian production plants, so maybe berries or nut trees, and then into some edge plants, so maybe some reeds, and the reeds can be harvested for material for use around the farm, for thatching, or for filling mattresses, or insulation of roof spaces, or building cob or something like that. And then the other water plants might be some edible plant like a watercress, maybe that could be incorporated into maybe an outlet from the pond, so that it's soaking up some of the excess nutrients from that aquaculture system before it leaves again. Or there can be some floating plants like a water lily that you can sell the bulbs within garden centres as a supplementary income. And then the same thing in the fish, looking at how you can incorporate different types of fish in with the production you've got. And there's even possibilities, so if you've got a predatory fish like a perch, for example, that might eat some of the other fish, so you might have a main production of goldfish in your pond, and then and that's where your income comes from, so you're selling the goldfish to the garden centre, but you want to also produce some fish for the table, so you want to maybe produce some perch in that pond. You could put those perch in a fish cage so that they don't eat the goldfish, but their production is tying in with the goldfish production, and you can just put them straight into that fish cage. They can grow to maturity, and then you can harvest them out of that fish cage. And maybe that fish cage is associated with an island, a floating island, to increase the habitat in that pond and shade that fish cage so that they don't get heat stress, and get some shelter to reduce their stress, so that their production is increased within that pond. And in a similar way, you may want to grow eels, maybe. So you might want to capture some wild eels and grow them to a certain size before they're matured, and you could create a division in your pond, perhaps, so that because they take a couple of 3-4 years to reach maturity, a good eel, so you might provide a division in your pond, maybe some permanent netting, so that there's a flow of water between the different parts of the pond, but a permanent fixture in that pond that separates one type of fish from another. Some other opportunities might be some crayfish. So when you drain the pond, perhaps to harvest your fish, at the same time you can harvest the crayfish, and the two can coexist in that habitat by filling different niches within it that are not competing against each other. So you should always monitor the quality of the water in the pond too, so regularly carry out a nitrate test to see if there's any peaks in nutrient levels in the pond, do a pH test to see if there's a shift in pH into levels that could start stressing your production or kill your fish even. So just feeling for the different inputs into that system and how they affect your system, and then once you get better at it, you can better manipulate the production in the aquaponics system by being more familiar with the inputs into that system and how you can moderate them in a way that you can predict how they'll impact the pH and the nutrient levels in your pond, such as stocking rate on your farm, or the addition of calcium carbonates to moderate the pH in your field might also moderate the pH in your pond, so you can start to see how the impact on one part of your system can flow into the impact on your aquaculture system too. And the last point was drainage of your pond. So when you set up your design, incorporating a way to drain it so that you can clean the pond, so you can if there's some contamination of the pond, you can drain it, you can take out that contamination, you can refill it. If you want to make use of the soil that's grown in the bottom of the pond, because there's pond aquatic systems are the best production system for topsoil because of the productivity of those systems and all the nutrients going into that system. They generate topsoil at the fastest rate. So as you drain a pond for any kind of maintenance, it's good to scoop out some of that soil at the bottom of the pond and apply it to other production systems, because it's a great little system for building soil. So some of the ways that you may drain the pond is having maybe a drainage pipe that's capped that goes through your dam wall, so you can remove that cap and drain the pond when need be. And you may incorporate a deeper area into that pond so that the fish will gather into that deeper area, and you can harvest them out of that when the rest of the pond has been drained. In a similar way, you can create a channel as part of the pond. So if you've got a pond here, the deep area may be a channel right at the end of it where your drainage pipe is, so that as all of this area is drained, you get a shallow bit of water here that you can easily harvest your fish from, and then you can do whatever maintenance you want to the pond and harvest your fish quite easily. So it's good to think ahead as to how you're going to harvest your fish and the design of your pond from the beginning.